Obedience is Rwandan Cowardice. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Chapter 1. Trauma-Informed Obedience. The Coming Silence. A footnote from the hole beneath the nation. The Heretics of Memory. In Rwanda, there is a certain kind of crime that carries no weapon, sheds no blood, makes no threat, and yet must be punished more severely than any rebellion. It is the crime of remembrance without permission, as though memory were not a birthright, but a sacrament to be administered by the state. To remember, in this context, is not merely an act of recollection, but a theological transgression, an attempt to commune with the dead without intercession, to mourn without liturgy, to speak to history without a priest. It is the assertion that one's soul may ache in a language unsanctioned, and that ache, left unconfessed, is a form of rebellion in itself. In Rwanda, to recall the past outside the margins drawn is blasphemous. And, like all blasphemies, it must be answered with ritual sacrifice. The case of Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza makes this truth unbearable. She returned to Rwanda from exile in the Netherlands in 2010, not with an army, not with propaganda, not with violence, but with a question. That was all. A question. A question that, on the surface, appears modest, even humane. Why is there no official recognition for Hutu civilians who also died during the genocide era? She did not deny the genocide. She did not glorify its perpetrators. She asked whether grief could be allowed to exist in more than one form. But in Rwanda, even the mildest challenge to the singular narrative is treated as an act of war. The state heard not a question, but an accusation. Not a plea for inclusivity, but an encoded threat. She was accused of harboring genocide ideology, a charge that means nothing and everything, a term so elastic it can be wrapped around any thought that strays from the state's script. Her real crime was not political. It was psychological. She committed the offense of emotional disobedience, a trespass not merely against the state, but against the sacred order it claims to steward. In choosing to remember differently, she exiled herself from the liturgy of state-sanctioned suffering, cast out like a heretic for daring to feel grief the wrong way. It was not a policy she violated, but a gospel, not a law, but a mythos. And for that, she was marked, not for correction, but for damnation. She refused to dream the dream that had been assigned to her. She remembered differently, and for that, she had to be removed. In the vocabulary of Fanon, she ruptured the post-colonial performance by introducing a second memory. But Fanon, for all his brilliance, speaks to the body. What she threatened was something deeper. The soul's secret allegiance to suffering. She interrupted performance. She desecrated ritual. She offered not revolution, but revelation. The terrifying suggestion that memory need not be singular to be sacred. She broke the mirror Kagame had so carefully constructed, a mirror polished to reflect only one image, a sanctified icon of unity and redemption, a false idol in the temple of national memory. By fracturing it, she did not just disrupt perception, she desecrated a shrine. She introduced multiplicity into what had been ordained as singular, making the reflection unstable, unholy. In the theology of the regime, she became a blasphemer of the sacred face. One Rwanda, one trauma, one savior. That is the formula. Victoire Ingabire inserted a second face into the mirror, a second wound, and in doing so, she became intolerable. Not because she could bring back violence, but because she brought back ambiguity. And ambiguity in Rwanda is dangerous. It reminds people they once had the capacity to feel things the government did not teach them to feel. But the regime's obsession with memory is not confined to its enemies. It devours its own saints as well. Consider the case of Kizito Mihigo, a genocide survivor, a devout Catholic, a state-sponsored gospel artist, a man who had sung for the president, grieved with the government, and been held aloft as the very embodiment of reconciliation. He was not merely tolerated, he was used. He was the face of the post-genocide miracle, the Tutsi survivor who forgave, who obeyed, who healed in exactly the way required. And then he sang the wrong song. In 2014, Mihigo released Igisobanuro shi urupfu, the meaning of death. It was a hymn not only to the victims of the genocide against the Tutsi, but also to those who died after, in reprisals, in silence, in the shadows, where no official grief dared follow. He sang for the others, the nameless, the ones who fell outside the permitted boundaries of mourning. His voice broke the spell. It reached into the forbidden space and declared that grief was not property, that compassion could not be rationed by decree. But Rwanda does not permit unfiltered mourning. It does not allow grief to rise like incense, unmeasured and unbound. In this regime, mourning must be sanctioned, choreographed, confined to the approved rites. To grieve beyond the script is to pray without a temple, to weep in tongues the state has declared profane. Grief becomes not just a feeling, but a forbidden theology, a sacrilege of empathy, a liturgy unsanctioned by power. It fears grief that speaks too broadly. The regime could not accuse him of genocide denial. He had survived it. He had honored it. He had lived within its official narrative for years. So they turned instead to fiction, conspiracy, treason. They claimed he had plotted to overthrow the state, had conspired with terrorists, had threatened the very stability he once symbolized. It was ridiculous. It was grotesque. It was entirely effective. They arrested him, forced him into confession, sentenced him, released him, rearrested him, and then he died. The state said suicide. The people smelled execution. Either way, it was a purification, a moral cleansing. He had stepped out of his role, and so he had to be erased, not just as a man, but as a possibility. The possibility that one could survive the genocide and still feel for others. The possibility that grief could belong to all. What these two figures represent, Ingabire and Mihigo, is not opposition. They represent heresy. Each, in their way, violated the sacred arrangement that Kagame's Rwanda demands: one trauma, one savior, one memory. Ingabire asked if others could be remembered. Mihigo asked if others could be mourned. Neither raised a weapon, neither preached hatred, but both broke the choreography. And in Rwanda, the script is survival. To deviate is to invite death. This is how the post-colonial state begins to devour itself, not through corruption or laziness, but through its relentless need to police emotion. It begins, like all revolutions, with real pain, real blood, real liberation, but it ends with an obsession to control the story of that pain. It will tolerate hunger before it tolerates unauthorized grief. It will forgive theft, but not a poem that mourns too widely. And I, watching this, cannot claim innocence. I do not live under this system, and yet I flinch when I hear their names. I flinch not from courage, but from the unbearable knowledge that I would have knelt. I would have signed the confession. I would have called betrayal wisdom, would have named silence peace. I would have envied their defiance while congratulating myself for surviving. And in the quiet of my room, I would have hated myself for it. Hated with a loathing that does not purify but corrodes. Because I know what it is to tremble in the face of meaning. I know what it is to barter one's soul for comfort and call it dignity. I would not have spoken. I would not have sung. I would have smiled at the right moment, bowed at the right angle, and swallowed my mourning until it became poison. I would have said thank you, even as my soul rotted, because I know the fear that silence breeds, and I know how seductive it is to believe that if one obeys the story, one might never have to feel again. I would not have sung. I would have smiled at the right moment, bowed at the right angle, and swallowed my mourning until it became poison. I would have said thank you, even as my soul rotted, because I know the fear that silence breeds, and I know how seductive it is to believe that if one obeys the story, one might never have to feel again. Kizito Mihigo sang about the sacredness of every human life, and for that, Rwanda's new order could not forgive him, because his song contained the one thing more dangerous than rebellion, unconditional compassion, a divine heresy, radiant and defiant like Christ weeping for both thief and priest. In a world built on sanctioned sorrow and partisan virtue, he sang a love that refused partition, a grace that disobeyed borders. His compassion was not weakness, it was apostasy. And in a state that fears unregulated memory, compassion is the final subversion. It refuses to choose sides. It grieves without permission. That is why he died. And when he died, the silence was not political, it was cosmic. The heavens did not split, no angels descended, and no voice cried out. Only the terrible hush of a world that punishes those who love too broadly. His death was not a message, but a wound. And like all holy wounds, it bleeds meaning long after the body is gone.